Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. My name is Kevin Gordon. I am a radio talk show host. More about me later. Today's topic, Russian meddling, or as I like to call it, the spoon-fed regurgitators in the mainstream media's Russian to judgment. Throughout this podcast, you're going to hear things you've never heard before. You are going to hear things that nobody else is talking about, but should be. On November the 8th, 2016, we, the people, sent a clear message to Washington, D.C. Enough is enough. We are tired of business as usual. It's time for you to work on behalf of the American people, not the other way around. We said it's time to put people over politics. This Russian scandal is an attempt by liberals, Democrats, the spoon-fed regurgitators in the mainstream media, and unfortunately, many in the Republican establishment, to stop any attempt to move our agenda forward. The agenda we voted for in November. Simply put, it is the unaffected class saying to us, the affected class, how dare you tell us that you know what's better for you than we do? How dare you think for yourselves? That's our job. Once in a while, liberals are honest. They actually tell you what they think. They think they are far superior to us intellectually. Here is Mika Brzezinski, co-host of MSNBC's weekday morning show, Morning Joe, being honest with us.
Well, and I think that the dangerous, edges here are that he's trying to undermine the media, trying to make up his own facts. And it could be that while unemployment and the economy worsens, he could have undermined the messaging so much that he can actually control exactly what people think. And that is our job.
Yeah, if you look at
That's our job. That's our job to tell people what to think. Unbelievable. Before we get into this Russian meddling issue, a bit about me. I have hosted morning shows in Richmond, Indiana, Frankfort, Kentucky, and a midday show in Little Rock, Arkansas. I am currently a fill-in talk show host at 55 KRC in Cincinnati. I am active in various groups here in this greater Cincinnati, northern Kentucky area, and occasionally I'm invited in as a guest to discuss various issues and topics. I have filled in and been a guest on 700 WLW in Cincinnati, and I have filled in at 840 WHAS in Louisville, Kentucky as well. This is the first of what will be many podcasts I will be producing on various topics throughout the coming days, weeks, months, and hopefully years to come. You will hear me cover the incomplete stories and the stories completely ignored by the spoon-fed regurgitators in the mainstream media. I encourage you to check out my Facebook page, cleverly named Kevin Gordon. You can learn more about me by clicking on the About button on my page. I am a conservative, I have an opinion, and I'm not afraid to use it. In a future podcast, I will offer you my definition of what conservative means. Back to today's topic, Russian meddling. First thing we need to do is what has been alleged, to talk about what's been alleged, and let's define it. So let's get to it. What has been alleged? We keep hearing Russia hacked the election, Russia hackers attempting to disrupt the 2016 election, the Russians interfered, the Russians meddled, Russian President Putin personally ordered an influence campaign, Russia colluded with the Trump campaign, on and on and on. Did Russia actually hack the 2016 presidential election? The simple answer to that is no, but let's break it down. Were there intrusions into state voter registration systems? There were attempts, but as of right now, there is absolutely no evidence that any of these attempts were successful. Were any voter files in any state compromised? In other words, hacked? No. Were any votes altered or changed? Again, the answer is no. As you will hear in a few seconds, even President Obama said so. So what did Russia do? It's been alleged that Russia intentionally tried to plant certain ideas and themes into the American electorate's consciousness, including the notion that the election was rigged against Trump. A theme he even picked up himself and talked about it, and it was widely disseminated and criticized over the mainstream media. To that point, and to the whole idea of hacking, President Obama is witness number one. Remember this from October the 18th, 2016?
But the larger point that I want to emphasize here is that there is no serious person out there who would suggest somehow that you could even rig America's elections, in part because they're so decentralized and the numbers of votes involved. There's no evidence that that has happened in the past, or that there are instances in which that will happen this time. And so I'd invite Mr. Trump to stop whining and go try to make his case to get votes.
So, whenever you hear the phrase hacking an election in the same sentence, you're being misled. It's also been claimed that Russians meddled in the election by disseminating fake news promoted on social media. Well, let's look at that. Russia was allegedly using trolls and bots to impact the news cycle by creating false surges of commentary online. They also used propaganda such as Russia Today, aka RT, to try to affect the national debate. I read a lot. I have never been to the site RT, Russia Today. I don't ever recall even seeing RT mentioned in a news story. I've never even heard or seen the phrase according to RT in a news story. And quite frankly, is this any different than the propaganda that was put on by the spoon-fed regurgitators in the mainstream media all throughout the campaign? Let's go back. After the Republican convention and the Trump bump, all we heard was voters, don't worry about that. Don't worry about the polls. Voters really don't start paying attention until around Labor Day. Then, a couple of days before Labor Day, all these polls came out and said, people's minds are made up. People are not going, there's no pathway for Trump to win. He really has no chance of winning. After the release of the WikiLeaks emails, and we learned just exactly how scummy Hillary, the DNC, John Podesta, and the rest of Hillary's campaign staff were, we heard phrases like, voters have already made up their minds. With early voting, any bad news has already been factored in. And shortly before, within a month before the election, we heard 1/3 of the voters have already voted. So any further bad news, there's too many votes that have been cast already to change the outcome. I would argue that all polls throughout that entire election cycle were nothing more than propaganda by the spoon-fed regurgitators in the mainstream media. This was a fraud perpetrated on the American public. And I think the goal of this was to suppress Trump voters from showing up at the polls. I mean, after all, if it's a lost cause, why bother showing up? Can anyone really legitimately say that Hillary received worse or even less favorable media coverage than Donald Trump? Trump was not only subjected to relentless partisan attacks, but also to overwhelmingly negative media coverage, not to mention the Never-Trumpers and the rhinos. According to Politico, and Politico is no right-wing publication, in an article they wrote, October the 25th, 2016, the headline, study, 91% of coverage on evening newscasts was negative to Donald Trump. According to the Media Research Center, they analyzed all 588 evening news stories that either discussed or mentioned the presidential campaign on ABC, CBS, NBC evening newscast from July the 29th until October 20th, including weekends. 91% negative coverage. Now, I'm not going to rehash everything that was said about Trump, but here's just a few examples. Numerous quotes of his were taken out of context, and many times he was misquoted. They talked about violence against people at his rallies, violence against the protesters that showed up at his rallies. Well, I guarantee you that if there were people that were harmed, they would have been front and center on every nightly newscast for weeks on end. So where were they? We do know that many of these protesters were hired by Hillary, George Soros, and the DNC to incite violence at his rally, at Trump rallies. We did see numerous Trump supporters attacked and bloodied outside these rallies. While I'm on the subject, with all the riots that have been taking place throughout this country over the last several months, who is behind this? Why isn't anybody investigating who's behind this? Who's paying these people? Why isn't anyone investigating who's paying these people? And if it's found out who's paying these people, why aren't they being charged under the Racketeer, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act, aka the RICO Act? Why isn't the Attorney General looking into this? Why isn't the FBI looking into this? Why isn't Congress looking into this? Why isn't this being talked about? Well, we're talking about it here. They also said he was racist. In fact, they still claim he's a racist. Funny, neither he nor any of his companies were ever the target of a Jesse Jackson shakedown. In fact, Jesse Jackson praised Donald Trump in 1999 for a lifetime of helping the African American community. Then there was his dust up with Megyn Kelly. Oh yeah, she acted like the innocent little schoolgirl. However, in 2010, she went on the Howard Stern show. She had no problems talking about her breasts, how big her husband's penis is, her legs, premarital sex, when she lost her virginity, and how much she liked aloof alpha bad boys. I would say Donald Trump fits that category. What a hypocrite she is, and still is, was and still is. The absolute worst story, though, was the Access Hollywood recording involving Billy Bush. 1 month before the election, on October the 7th, 2016, the Washington Post released a leaked video. Remember, leaked. How have we seen that? How many times have we seen that word used over the last several months? With an accompanying article about Donald Trump and television host Billy Bush having, quote, an extremely lewd conversation about women in 2005. 2005. 11 years before this tape was released. 11 years. In a recent interview, Billy Bush, back in May, said that he had long been aware of its existence and that, quote, plenty of people at NBC knew about it too. Why did NBC sit on this story for so long? In an ironic twist, they sat on it so long that I guess people thought that it wasn't going to be put out there, so they leaked it to the Washington Post, and then they put it out there. So the NBC got scooped. They wound up having to put that story out there and talk about it about a day and a half before they really wanted to. They could have released this tape, they could have released this recording at any time. They could have released it in June of 2015, right after Trump announced his candidacy. They could have done it any time during the Republican primary, but no, they waited until it could have the absolute maximum damage to his candidacy. Kind of reminds me of the Dan Rather story, the hit piece on George W. Bush 2 months before the 2004 election. Now, that story was done 2 months before the election, and it was able to be tamped down. I guess NBC thought if we release it a month ahead of time, there won't be any chance for this story to go away. The same women who flocked to see vagina monologues, who devoured the novel 50 Shades of Grey, which, by the way, has sold over 125 million copies worldwide and has been translated into 52 languages. The movie itself has earned well over $571 million worldwide. Suddenly, these women were outraged by locker room talk. Give me a break. And some of the loudest people regarding this tape were people, some of these celebrities, that showed up at that March for Women the day after the inauguration. Well, let me tell you, based on their comments from the stage, you can sure tell that they were a bunch of sweet, delicate, innocent little flowers. I just can't believe the false narrative that were put behind this. The fake news, basically, surrounding this. We keep hearing that false stories were circulated about Hillary. That's one of the things they talk about. Okay, where are they? Where are they? Has anybody at any time sat on a set at any television show, any talk program, and said, okay, I have 3 stories right here. Right here on this particular story, they said this about Hillary, or they said this about Hillary, or they said some other such thing about Hillary. Has anybody done that? Have we even seen it in print? Have they even mentioned any of those stories? Who needed false stories? America saw Hillary leave the 9/11 memorial early, collapse, was unresponsive, and had to be dragged into the van. Dragged into the van, and she lost her shoe in the process. By the way, the media did try to hide that story until a citizen journalist posted the video on YouTube. Who needed false stories when we had Hillary Clinton saying things like,
You know, to just be grossly generalistic, you could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. Right? The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. And unfortunately, there are people like that. And he has lifted them up.
and then of course, we had Hillary talking about Bernie Sanders supporters.
Some are new to politics completely. They're children of the Great Recession.
And who created that recession and didn't get us out of it? Your administration and Barack Obama's.
And the jobs that are available to them are not at all what they envisioned for themselves. And they don't see much of a future. I met with a group of young black millennials today, and one of the young women said, none of us feel like we have the job that we should have gotten out of college. And we don't believe that the job market is going to give us much of a chance. So that
didn't change over the last 8
really
years.
Affecting their politics. And so if you're feeling that you're consigned to, being a barista or
that's a bit
some
condescending.
other job that doesn't pay a lot and doesn't have much of a ladder of opportunity attached to it, then the idea that maybe, just maybe, you could be part of a political revolution is pretty appealing.
But Kevin, what about the DNC and Podesta emails? I'm glad you asked that question. I want to be very clear here. This was no hack. This was a phishing scam. According to an article in The Hill, dated December the 13th, 2016, typo led to Podesta email hack. Last March, Podesta received an email purportedly from Google saying hackers had tried to infiltrate his Gmail account. When an aide emailed the campaign's IT staff to ask if the notice was real, the Clinton campaign aide, Charles Delavan, replied that it was a, quote, legitimate email and that Podesta should change his password. Instead of telling the aide that the email was a threat and that a good response would be to change his password directly through Google's website, he had inadvertently told the aide to click on the fraudulent email and give the attackers access to the account. It was a phishing exercise. They voluntarily gave over the information. And interestingly enough, you can go on WikiLeaks, so you can go on the web on the internet, and you can pull off actual transcripts of the emails that were done throughout, that were all released by WikiLeaks. And this email verified that, and the heading was "Someone has your password," and it's from a campaign aide at HillaryClinton.com. HillaryClinton.com. The same email address that she used while she was Secretary of State and that she had on an unsecured server, and we'll talk about that later on. In this, it said, this is a legitimate email. He meant to put an illegitimate email. CNN. The DNC didn't secure their email systems. Source, according to CNN, sources, UN officials warned DNC of a hack months before the party acted. This is a story from July the 26th, 2016. You may have remember this from last month. This was big news. Everybody talked about it, and they said that in this, it shows that President Obama knew about this well in advance of when he said that he knew about this. Federal investigators tried to warn the Democratic National Committee about a potential intrusion into their computer networks months before the party moved to try to fix the problem. U.S. officials briefed on the probe tell CNN. The revelation raises questions about whether the DNC could have done more to limit the damage done by hackers, again the word hackers, the phishing exercise, suspected of working for Russian intelligence. Democrats, including some in Congress, are trying to pressure the White House to publicly name Russia as the perpetrator in the way that the government named South Korea in the Sony hack, and China for hacking various U.S. companies. The Obama administration has resisted publicly naming Russia despite evidence gathered by U.S. government investigators showing Russia behind cyber attacks on U.S. government agencies, even in the publication and the release in 2014 of hacked phone call between U.S. diplomats in Ukraine that was a cause for embarrassment. And I hope I mentioned that this was a story from July of 2016. I don't know if I said 2017, but I apologize for that. In some recent stories, there has been some question as to whether or not these emails were even hacked by the Russians. You may recall Seth Rich. He was a DNC staffer. He worked for the DNC. He was murdered on July the 10th, 2016. New bombshell report shows DNC emails were copied on the East Coast 5 days before Seth Rich murder, which, according to them, disproves the Russian hacking theory. As you may recall, this whole Russian hacking thing came about that this claim by a guy by the name of Guccifer 2.0 that he was the one that actually hacked into the emails. He was actually interviewed by a couple of stations. I believe he was interviewed by Fox. When he was arrested and he was deported to Romania and charged and jailed there, all of a sudden he changed his tune. All of a sudden he claimed that he wasn't the person that hacked. Now, we'll hear later on that maybe he was the person that received these emails, but he wasn't the one that did the hacking. As a matter of fact, James Comey, in his testimony before Congress, seems to back up that assertion, that Guccifer 2.0 was not the hacker. Comey testified to Congress that it was the assessment of the FBI that, quote, hostile actors gained access to the private commercial accounts of people with whom Hillary Clinton was in regular contact from her personal account. Now, in a detailed report released by a mysterious IT specialist that goes by the name of Forensicator, he published a detailed report that appears to disprove the theory that the DNC was hacked by Russia. Without going into all the details that I know my geek friends would love, about all the different Linux and all the different operating systems that were used. It basically boils down to that on July the 5th, 2016, again, 5 days before Seth Rich was murdered, at 6:45 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, someone copied data that eventually appears on this zip drive that was disseminated and that eventually were published by a persona Guccifer 2.0. Based on the markers on these emails, it was indicated that it was done, and the way they think about it was that it was done somewhere on the East Coast because of the date stamp and the time stamp on that. They also determined that the speed at which this was downloaded could not have been done over the internet. It had to be somebody who had direct contact with the DNC computers. Most likely, again, on the East Coast. And the speed at which this was downloaded indicates that it was done via a flash drive. So somebody had access to the DNC computers, downloaded stuff on a flash drive, and took it away. Now, back to Seth Rich. Again, he was murdered on July the 10th, 2016. He was on his way home. He was on the phone with his girlfriend, his fiancée. Seth Rich was hired by the Democratic Party as the official voter expansion data director. Although there is no confirmed connection yet, that he is clearly privy to information that could have potentially harmed the Democratic Party, more specifically Hillary Clinton's chances of winning the election in November. However, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has strongly hinted that it was Seth Rich. Love him or hate him, Julian Assange has never been proven wrong on anything, and WikiLeaks has never been proven wrong. Julian Assange even gave an interview on a Dutch TV station or a Dutch program called Newser. Here is what he had to say.
Whistleblowers go to significant efforts to get us material and often very significant risks. There's a 27-year-old works for the DNC who was shot in the back, murdered just 2 weeks ago for unknown reasons as he was walking down the street in Washington. So
That was just a robbery, I believe, wasn't it?
no, there's no finding. So that's the sort of...
What are you suggesting?
I'm suggesting that our sources take risks, and they become concerned to see things occurring like that.
But was he one of your sources then? I mean,
we don't comment on who our sources are.
why make the suggestion about a young guy being shot in the streets of Washington?
Because we have to understand how high the stakes are in the United States, and that our sources are, our sources face serious risks. That's why they come to us, so we can protect their anonymity.
But it's quite something to suggest a murder. That's basically what you're doing.
Well, that others have suggested that. We are investigating to understand what happened in that situation with Seth Rich. I think it is a concerning situation. There's not a conclusion yet. We wouldn't be willing to state a conclusion, but we are concerned about it. And more importantly, a variety of WikiLeaks sources are concerned when that kind of thing happens.
Now, listening to that, he seems to come right up to the toe of the line. Didn't quite cross it, but seems like he was strongly suggesting that Seth Rich was the person that did this. There have been rewards offered for information leading to the conviction of person or persons responsible for the murder of Seth Rich. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has offered $20,000 reward. By the way, the total reward money right now stands at $350,000. Julian Assange, $20,000. The Herring Networks media company One America News Network is offering $100,000. The D.C. Metropolitan Police Department is offering $25,000. Businessman and investor Mark Shkreli is offering $100,000. Jack Berkman, a lawyer and GOP lobbyist who is funding a team of investigators to find Rich's killer, is offering $105,000. Did you notice who's not on that list? The DNC. Their employee is murdered, and they don't offer a single penny towards the reward trying to find who his killer is. Kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? Oh, but hey, the DNC, they did honor Seth Rich by putting a memorial bike rack in his honor outside the DNC headquarters. Back to the emails. If we had a media in this country, if we had a decent media in this country that wasn't colluding with Hillary campaign, maybe they would have uncovered some of the stuff that was reported by WikiLeaks. Because I'm sure a lot of stuff was leaked to them by Democratic staffers, and especially disaffected Bernie Sanders supporters. Is it possible that the media did know these things but failed to report it? Should we not have known that the DNC favored Hillary? That they rigged the primaries against Bernie Sanders, that Hillary cheated in the debates? DNC head Donna Brazile was caught. The chairman of the DNC was caught giving multiple debate questions to Hillary. That Hillary campaign was in direct communication with Loretta Lynch and the Department of Justice regarding the status of the Hillary investigation. They were assured that the investigation would not go too far. And a side note, former FBI director testified before Congress that Lynch insisted that it be called a matter instead of an investigation. It was the same talking point that the Hillary campaign was using, that the matter. So is this a little bit of collusion between the Justice Department and the Clinton campaign? Should we not have known that Obama lied, that he knew about Hillary's secret server and wrote to her using a pseudonym? He was using a fake name. That the cover-up happened. Was this intentional? Of course it was, because we have such a thing called the Freedom of Information Act. Anything that is put on paper, anything that is discussed, unless it is classified, is subject to a request from the Freedom of Information Act. But if you've got a server, if you're communicating privately, of course nobody's going to know about that, so therefore they're not going to be able to ask about it. I think that's part, if you drill down on this, this is going to be one of the reasons why Hillary wasn't charged, and because this would implicate whoever she communicated with on her private server and the private email account. Anytime Barack Obama used a fake name, he should have been prosecuted. He's guilty. How many times did the CIA director, the director of national intelligence, the FBI director, the Defense Department, any other people in the cabinet positions communicate with the Secretary of State? Every time they communicated over an unsecured server, they are guilty. Think about that. Should we not have known that according to members of her own staff, her instincts can be terrible? Doesn't seem to, that's one area. Doesn't seem to know what planet we're all living on at the moment. That Hillary Clinton dreams of completely open borders. Should we not have known that Hillary Clinton received money and supported nations that she knew funded ISIS and terrorists? Should we not have known that Podesta's email from August 2016 with the phrase needy Latinos in the subject line, with names and contacts of information for Latino politicians who he recommended Clinton call to gain their support? Needy Latinos. Should we not have known the list of reporters that Hillary wined and dined off the record, including the biggest pundits, the journalists and pundits of CNN, ABC, NBC, MSNBC, New York Times, and many more? If they're your buddies, are they going to write bad stories about you? Hell no. Should we not have known that the New York Times was colluding with Hillary? They allowed the campaign editorial review over stories. Should we not have known that Hillary's Wall Street speeches, assuring them that she didn't mean what she had to say on the campaign trail? And in my opinion, the absolute most egregious of all these emails revealed the contempt of Hillary's people have and John Podesta have for the Catholic Church. Sandy Newman, president and the founder of the progressive nonprofit Voices for Progress, writes to Podesta in an email titled Opening for a Catholic Spring, just musing. There needs to be a Catholic spring. You mean as an Arab Spring? You mean in terms of a revolution, overthrowing the Catholic Church? What? Ousting the Pope and putting your own Pope in there? In which the Catholics themselves demand an end to the Middle Ages dictatorship and the beginning of a little democracy and respect for gender equality in the Catholic Church. In response, Podesta assures Newman to rest easy that he and his progressive pals have already created such an organization, explicitly designed to infiltrate the Catholic Church. Infiltrate. Do you remember the flap over the talk of infiltrating mosques to find out if there were terrorists in there? So the Catholic Church is worse than the terrorists. The Catholic Church needs to be infiltrated, and they're all for that. That the Catholic Church needs to be infiltrated with progressive ideology, though he cautions that the time may not be right for a full revolution just yet. We created Catholics in Alliance for Common Good to organize for a moment like this, but I think it lacks the leadership to do so now. Likewise, Catholics United, like most spring movements, I think will have to be from the bottom up, Podesta writes. This group, Catholics in Alliance for Common Good, was funded by George Soros and Podesta to provide a liberal revolt against U.S. bishops, to undermine and manipulate Catholic leadership. So much for separation of church and state. This is straight out of the Saul Alinsky book, Rules for Radicals. You got to destroy the opposition. You can't argue with them. You can't try to convince them. You must destroy them. Folks, if you aren't happy that the curtain was pulled back on the Democrats and the Hillary campaign, if you aren't happy that Hillary and her people were revealed for exactly who they are, then I guess when you watch The Wizard of Oz, you think Toto is a bad doggy. So, why are the spoon-fed regurgitators in the mainstream media obsessed with Russia? Russia wasn't a threat back in 2012. Do you remember this? On October the 22nd, 2012, during the debate with Mitt Romney?
When you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia. Not Al-Qaeda, you said Russia. And the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back because the Cold War's been over for 20 years. Russia.
Is Russia a state? It wasn't a concern back in 2012. Russia wasn't a concern. Is Russia a state sponsor of terrorism? Not according to the State Department's website. Iran, Sudan, and Syria are listed as state sponsors of terrorism. James Clapper, director of the National Intelligence, didn't sound the alarm regarding Russia in a 33-page report to Congress, to the statement for the record, worldwide threat assessment of the U.S. intelligence community to the Senate Armed Services Committee. James R. Clapper, Director of National Intelligence, February the 9th, 2016. In this, they list the table of contents talking about cyber technology, terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, counterintelligence, transnational organized crime. When you get to the various headings regarding Russia, China, North Korea, I'm just going to read you this first line. Cyber threats from Russia. Russia is assuming a more assertive cyber posture based on its willingness to target critical infrastructure systems. They talk in here about Russia trying to spread propaganda throughout other countries to offset what our criticism of them are, trying to bolster up their standing in the world. China continues to have success in cyber espionage against the U.S. government, our allies, and companies. They continue. Russia, on the other hand, is assuming a more assertive role. North Korea probably remains capable and willing to launch disruptive and destructive cyber attacks to support its political objectives. On WMDs, North Korea. North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile program will continue to pose serious threat to the U.S. interests. When it comes to Russia, having to do with, all they talk about is a cruise missile that they have developed, a land-based intermediate range missile in violation of a 1987 treaty. Russia claims that, to adhere to that means that, there have been short-range missiles put near them, so they ought to be able to retaliate. Chinese People's Liberation Army has established a rocket force. So they are being deemed as something to watch out for. Regional threats. Talking about China's incursion into the South China Sea, where they're trying to build up and increase territory to take over large swaths of the Pacific to disrupt trade and disrupt troop movement. North Korea. Talking about what a threat they are. Russia. According to this report, if you're in Ukraine, yeah, Russia is a threat to you, but not the United States. They don't talk about them being a geopolitical threat. Here's what they had to say about Iran. None of this strong language is used about Russia. The Islamic Republic of Iran presents an enduring threat to U.S. national interest because of its support for regional terrorists and militant groups in the Assad regime, as well as the development of advanced military capabilities. There was a report in June the 23rd, 2017. Barack Obama received bombshell information from the CIA last August the 26th, warning him that Russia President Vladimir Putin was directly hacking to try to tip the presidential election in Trump's favor. The Washington Post reported on Friday, back in July of this past month. I'm sorry, in June of June of 2017. In that previous story, there was indication that they knew about it in July of 2016. But Obama did nothing. He did absolutely nothing. So apparently he wasn't concerned about Russian hacking. And so therefore, I guess he figured that Hillary was going to win. So why sound the alarm? Why call attention to it? So what about Vladimir Putin? In an article in the Washington Times, Monday, January the 2nd, 2017, confusing Putin with the old Soviet threat, demonizers of Russia forget what actual danger looks like. He is an internally popular Russian nationalist who runs what by U.S. standards is a crony capitalist autocracy and has acted internationally in ways that deserve condemnation. But he is neither Hitler nor Stalin. He has been accused of killing 10, 12, some as high as 15 have been reported, journalists and political rivals. Have you seen the Clinton body count? Currently it stands at 33. I've seen some lists as high as 47. Bill and Hillary's friends fall off buildings, commit suicide, crash planes, die in freak accidents. I am amazed at the liberals' obsession with Russia. It is absolutely absurd. During the Cold War, you couldn't get them to say anything bad about the Soviet Union. Liberals have always had a soft spot in their hearts for communism. Why do you think so many of their policies are socialism, or socialist in nature? Communism, I might remind you, is responsible for over 100 million murders in the 20th century. Stalin in the USSR, 20 million, with estimates as high as 60 million. Mao Zedong, China, between 60 and 80 million. Fidel Castro, 15,000. Pol Pot, Cambodia, between 1.5 and 2 million. North Korea, between 710,000 and 3.5 million. The only reason we don't have an accurate count, and that number is growing, is because they are such a closed society, and our intelligence networks have a difficulty getting in there and getting accurate information. That's why we don't have so much accurate information on their nuclear program. Africa, 1.7 million. Afghanistan, 1.5 million. Vietnam, 1 million. Latin America, 150,000. And in communist states in Eastern Europe, over 1 million. I would be willing to bet that most liberals still have Che Guevara t-shirts hanging in their closets. Che, who was Castro's right-hand man during the Cuban Revolution. Che, who was responsible for thousands of the murders of men, women, and children. You have Franklin Roosevelt cozying up to the liberal icon. Franklin Roosevelt, liberal icon. He wrote to the Democratic Party, cozied up to Joseph Stalin. Remember, Joseph Stalin, guilty of over 20 million murders, up to as high as 60 million. Roosevelt cozied up to him so much that he called him Uncle Joe. Because of FDR's capitulation at Yalta, millions of Eastern Europeans from the end of the Cold War, to the end of World War II in 1945 until the end of the Cold War in 1991, were condemned to be under the brutal tyranny of the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain. Throughout our history, there have been 5 times that Democrats have tried to work with Russians. And excuse me for a second, I got to dip down here and get that story. A little windy out here on the deck today. 5 times Democrats tried to work with the Russians to swing elections. By the count in here, it's actually more like 7. We'll get to it. The first one. Reagan biographer Craig Shirley wrote in one of his books that during the 1976 election, Carter versus... in the 76 election, in the Carter election, the Soviet Union had made overtures to the Carter campaign, even going so far as suggesting that they could possibly pursue policies that could affect the outcome of the election so as to favor Carter. Number 2, former Senator Ted Kennedy twice reached out to the Soviet Union for election help. The first, he reached out and tried to get the assistance of John Tooney, Democrat of California, at the behest of his friend Ted Kennedy, to lobby the Soviet Union to, quote, sabotage Jimmy Carter's foreign policy efforts, as this was during Kennedy's primary challenge to Carter in 1980. This was Carter's second election. He was elected in 1976 against Gerald Ford, the name I was trying to come up a moment before. But he was Ted Kennedy challenged Carter in 1980. Jimmy Carter tried to work with the Soviets during the 1980 campaign. After he defeated Ted Kennedy, he was worried about his chances of beating Ronald Reagan. Carter, through his political ally Armand Hammer, lobbied the Soviet Union to let Jewish refuseniks immigrate to Israel to strengthen Carter's standing in important states, but the Soviets rebuffed Carter's interest. Additionally, Ted Kennedy, in 1983, Kennedy reached out to the Soviet Union in an attempt to undermine Ronald Reagan's foreign policy and weaken his re-election prospects in 1984, even going so far as offering to set up television interviews in America in order to make the Soviets come across as more peaceful, working together with the media outlets. Let me go back to 1980 again, because this is important and I missed it. A document stated that Kennedy offered to condemn President Carter's policy towards the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in exchange for KGB help. News accounts of that period prove that Kennedy did in fact openly criticize Carter's Afghanistan policy. When Tip O'Neill was Speaker of the House, he wanted the Soviets on the Democrats' side. During the 1984 election, according to Michael Reagan, O'Neill told the Soviet Union ambassador of the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin, quote, that it was in everyone's best interest if the Soviets would help the Democrats keep the demagogue Reagan from being reelected. O'Neill warned Dobrynin that the quote, primitive instincts of this, quote, dangerous man would plunge the world into war. Bill Clinton pledged to support Russian President Boris Yeltsin in 1996 if Yeltsin agreed to clear up negative issues. The Washington Times unearthed a confidential memo in 1996. Basically, President Clinton wanted him to release or reduce or relax this poultry import ban that the Soviet Union had, because in exchange he would help Yeltsin in his election campaign in 1996. Because, after all, 40% of poultry production is done in Arkansas. And in number 7, Barack Obama, with his off-the-mic remarks to President Medvedev. We'll get to that one in a little while. Russian involvement in the 2016 election. I have been saying for a while now, and nobody has quite honestly offered an answer to this very basic question. I don't hear it being talked about in the news stories. I don't hear anybody actually giving an answer to this. Given the fact that Russia, Vladimir Putin, had their way with Obama for 8 years, and the entire time that Hillary was Secretary of State, and that if elected, Clinton basically promised the continuation of Obama's foreign policy, why in the hell would the Russians want Donald Trump instead of Hillary? Here's a little refresher for you of what went on during the Obama years. March the 6th, 2009. Russian reset button. What a joke. Our people broke off this plastic crappy looking button that was on a jacuzzi. There are some stories that said that they actually stole it from the hotel, put it in a box, put a Russian word on it that was supposed to mean reset, and presented it to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Lavrov corrected them during this press conference and said, well, the word actually means overcharged. March the 24th, 2010, in an interview, Hillary told Russian journalist Vladimir Posner that, quote, our goal is to strengthen Russia. Doesn't sound like an enemy to me. In 2009 to 2013, cash flowed to the Clinton Foundation. In a New York Times piece that was written April the 24th, 2015, talking about all the cash that was flowed from that Uranium One deal, where Hillary signed off on 20% of our uranium production going to Russia. For those of you that may not be aware, uranium is the basic fuel component, is the principal fuel for nuclear reactors. It is the basic raw material for nuclear weapons. But she gave away 20% of our uranium production to the Russians. There's a story that supports this in the Huffington Post. Huffington Post is no right-wing publication. In February of 2017, according to Clinton Cash author Peter Schweitzer, that the shareholders of Uranium One, the company that Hillary allowed to get the 20% production, transactions transferred $145 million to the Clinton Foundation for its initiatives. March the 26th, 2012, in this off the mic, President Obama caught in a private conversation on a hot mic in Seoul, South Korea, telling outgoing Russian President Dmitry Medvedev that Vladimir Putin should give him more space. On all these issues, particularly missile defense, this can be solved. It's important to give me space. I understand. Message about space. Space for you.
Place for you. This is my last election.
This is my last election.
After my election, I have more flexibility. I understand. I transmit this information to Vladimir and my friend.
I'll transmit this information to Vladimir. I stand with you. Then, of course, we have the October the 22nd, 2012, Romney talking during the debates. We played that tape earlier, or played that recording earlier. 2014, Russia invades Crimea, or Korea, if you're Maxine Waters. The U.S. does nothing. In 2015, Syria. Russia has supported Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's government since the beginning of the Syrian conflict in 2011, politically with military aid, and since 30 September 2015, also through direct military involvement. For over 70 years, we have kept the Soviets out. We have kept Russia out of the Middle East. But thanks to the Obama administration, they are now a major player in Middle East politics. Is it logical that if Russia was clever enough to be involved in the 2016 election, that they weren't clever enough to hack Hillary's homebrew server maintained by a mom and pop outfit run out of a bathroom closet in Denver loft? Pardon the pun, but this doesn't pass the smell test. Nobody seems to be concerned about that at all the possible classified information that they received. Nobody seems to be concerned about all those emails. If Vlad and the boys wanted Trump over to Hillary so bad, why didn't they release any of these emails? Wouldn't that have hurt Hillary's campaign more than the Podesta emails or any of that sort of stuff? To summarize, no Russian hacking of votes. The media clearly in Hillary's favor. 91% of Trump stories were negative. Media colluded with the Hillary campaign. No evidence of false stories planted. Until Trump won, no one was warning about Russian involvement. The Obama administration never declared Russia a security threat. Far more evidence of Obama and Hillary working with the Russians. This Russian investigation is a fraud, plain and simple. The only conclusion is that this entire Russian hysteria has been orchestrated by the corrupt liberal Democrats and the spoon-fed regurgitators in the mainstream media. Thank you for tuning in. Please share this. The subject of my next podcast in a few days. Democrats have a lot of nerve criticizing anyone about meddling and interfering in other elections. I am Kevin Gordon. Check out my Facebook page, Kevin Gordon. I look forward to bringing you more of the incomplete stories and the stories completely ignored by the spoon-fed regurgitators in the mainstream media. Take care.